Karoline Leavitt has emerged as a central figure in reshaping the narrative around media access and representation in American political discourse. Her recent actions signal a deliberate shift away from the traditional gatekeeping of mainstream media outlets and toward a more inclusive, digitally empowered press environment. She has vocally criticized what she perceives as an elitist and entrenched media class that prioritizes legacy institutions over the evolving landscape of journalism, particularly digital platforms, independent voices, and grassroots reporting. This position is not merely a rhetorical posture, but a strategic recalibration of how political information is shared and consumed. By questioning the assumed authority and neutrality of mainstream media organizations, she challenges the idea that credible journalism must only flow through long-established channels. Her critiques stem from a belief that these outlets often act less as impartial observers and more as ideological actors who filter narratives to suit specific political or cultural biases. In doing so, they risk alienating vast segments of the public who no longer feel represented or even acknowledged by the traditional media establishment. In her view, the media should serve as a conduit for public accountability, not a selective megaphone for a cultural elite. The rise of independent journalists, social media commentators, podcasters, and content creators who gather, analyze, and distribute news in real time reflects a democratization of information that she believes should be embraced, not dismissed. These non-traditional figures often have deeper, more authentic connections with their audiences, many of whom distrust the mainstream press. By giving them a seat at the table, literally and figuratively, she seeks to break the monopolistic grip that elite media organizations have historically held on political narratives. This approach also acknowledges the technological and cultural transformations that have redefined how people engage with news. The digital age has introduced new avenues of storytelling, from viral clips and live streams to interactive discussions and citizen journalism. These formats, often faster and more responsive than legacy newsrooms, provide alternative perspectives that challenge the conventional wisdom perpetuated by large media corporations. By elevating these voices, she is not advocating for the replacement of professional journalism, but rather for a rebalancing, an expansion of the press corps that reflects the diversity of opinion and experience in modern America. Her stance has not been without controversy. Critics argue that opening the door to new media could undermine journalistic standards or invite partisan agitators into spaces meant for objective inquiry. But such criticism, she contends, often reveals the underlying anxiety of an old guard that is resistant to change and fearful of losing its privileged position. To her, the issue is not about lowering standards, but about broadening access. If independent journalists are held to the same ethical expectations as traditional reporters, their presence should not be seen as a threat, but as an enrichment of the public discourse. Furthermore, this push for inclusivity aligns with a broader populist sentiment that seeks to dismantle the perceived structures of elitism in Washington, D.C. The consolidation of media power in coastal urban centers has contributed to a growing disconnect between the press and the everyday realities of Americans in smaller towns and rural areas. By bringing in voices from outside the typical media power hubs, she hopes to give a platform to stories and communities that are often overlooked or misunderstood by national outlets. This perspective also reflects a deeper understanding of political communication in the 21st century. Traditional media filters are no longer the only or even the primary lens through which citizens interpret events. People now curate their own information diets, often turning to trusted individuals rather than institutions. By legitimizing these figures and granting them institutional access, she is responding to a profound cultural shift that has already occurred across much of the electorate. Her critics may insist on preserving the sanctity of legacy press credentials, but she argues that credibility is earned through transparency, engagement, and trust, attributes that are not exclusive to establishment journalists. In her efforts to reshape White House media policy, she is not simply making room for political allies or seeking favorable coverage. Instead, she is acting on a vision of media pluralism that sees value in a multiplicity of voices, formats, and frameworks. Whether through live streams from independent correspondents or detailed investigative threads on social media, she believes the American people are best served when they have access to a wider range of perspectives, not just those sanctioned by legacy newsrooms. This philosophy is a clear break from past traditions, but it is grounded in a belief that true accountability and representation cannot exist without openness to change. Karoline Leavitt's decision to abstain from attending the White House Correspondents' Association dinner marked more than a simple calendar change. It was a symbolic act rooted in a broader critique of the relationship between political power and media elitism. Her boycott of the event was driven by a deeply held conviction that the dinner no longer serves its original purpose of promoting transparency, press freedom, and journalistic excellence. Instead, she sees it as an annual spectacle where establishment media figures and political elites engage in self-congratulatory rituals that exclude rising independent voices in journalism. To her, the dinner has evolved into an exclusive club, where legacy journalists, celebrities, and powerful insiders gather in an atmosphere that is increasingly disconnected from the people they purport to represent. This perception of elitism and detachment was central to her critique. The event, once designed to foster goodwill between the press and political figures, now appears more like a red carpet gala than a celebration of the Fourth Estate's crucial role in a healthy democracy. In her view, it reinforces a hierarchy in the media landscape where only certain outlets and individuals are deemed worthy of access and recognition, leaving others marginalized regardless of their actual impact or audience size. By refusing to attend, she was making a stand on behalf of those who have been excluded from the traditional media sphere. The independent journalists, podcasters, digital creators, and grassroots reporters who cover stories that often go unnoticed by major networks. These individuals are not typically invited to such events, despite the fact that many of them reach millions of Americans and play an increasingly vital role in informing the public. Her absence was therefore a show of solidarity with these overlooked voices and a protest against what she sees as the entrenched favoritism of the legacy press. Her actions also reflect a growing frustration among Americans who feel that mainstream media institutions are out of touch with their values, concerns, and lived realities. The Correspondents' Dinner, from this perspective, becomes a symbol of that disconnect, a gathering where media elites applaud each other while ignoring the erosion of trust that has plagued their industry for years. By skipping the dinner, she signaled that this status quo is unacceptable and that substantive reform is needed in how media institutions operate and who they recognize as legitimate contributors to public discourse. Moreover, her decision underscored a broader philosophical approach to media relations, one that prioritizes authenticity, accessibility, and engagement over prestige and ceremony. Rather than participating in an event that she believes glamorizes the press rather than holding it accountable, she focused her energy on promoting alternative channels of communication, channels that speak directly to the public without the filter of legacy media narratives. Her message was clear. Credibility should not be earned through proximity to power or celebrity, but through the consistent delivery of truthful, relevant, and unfiltered information. Critics accused her of undermining tradition and disrespecting journalistic institutions. But to her, the greater disrespect lies in maintaining rituals that perpetuate exclusion and ignore the public's growing disillusionment with conventional news sources. She believes that real support for journalism means advocating for its evolution, not clinging to outdated events that prioritize optics over substance. For her, the future of journalism lies in embracing innovation, decentralization, and diverse voices that reflect the breadth of the American experience. Her decision was also a call to action, an invitation for the media industry to take a hard look at its own practices and reconsider what it means to serve the public interest. In a time when technology has fundamentally changed the way people access and interpret information, media institutions must do more than host elite dinners. They must engage with audiences outside of their echo chambers, open themselves to criticism, and invite in new perspectives that challenge their assumptions. This means making room for unconventional reporters, questioning their own biases, and breaking down barriers that have historically kept outsider voices on the margins. By rejecting the White House Correspondents' Dinner, she wasn't rejecting journalism itself. She was rejecting the narrow definition of journalism that the event often reinforces. She chose not to participate in what she viewed as a pageant of exclusion, opting instead to focus on creating a media environment where diversity of thought, transparency, and public engagement are not only welcomed but prioritized. Her actions serve as a pointed reminder that traditions must evolve if they are to remain relevant, and that the future of media depends on its willingness to be inclusive, self-aware, and unafraid. Karoline Leavitt's decision to introduce a new media seat in the White House press briefing room represented a significant and deliberate shift in how access to political information is structured. This move aimed to dismantle long-standing hierarchies within the press corps and make space for voices that have historically been left out of mainstream political reporting. For decades, access to the briefing room has largely been dominated by legacy media institutions, major television networks, newspapers, and wire services, whose influence and proximity to power have afforded them a monopoly over the questions asked and the narratives presented to the public. By carving out a seat specifically for new media, Leavitt acknowledged the growing impact of digital platforms and independent creators in shaping public opinion. Bloggers, podcasters, YouTubers, Substack writers, and social media commentators are no longer fringe voices. Many of them command massive followings and have built reputations for in-depth, on-the-ground reporting that often surpasses the reach of traditional outlets. Despite this, they have routinely been excluded from briefings, lacking the institutional backing or corporate sponsorship traditionally required for accreditation. The new seat signified an effort to democratize access, making clear that influence and relevance are no longer measured solely by a byline in a newspaper or a slot on cable news. The implementation of this initiative was not just about symbolic inclusion. It was a concrete step toward reflecting the changing nature of journalism itself. In the age of decentralized media, trust in legacy institutions has declined, while trust in individual creators and commentators has grown, largely because they are seen as more transparent, accountable, and responsive. They operate without the editorial constraints or corporate filters that often shape coverage in traditional newsrooms. As a result, they are often more willing to tackle stories that legacy outlets ignore or frame differently due to institutional biases. Leavitt's inclusion of the new media seat was also about ensuring the administration was subject to scrutiny from a broader array of perspectives. Traditional reporters often approach briefings with a similar set of assumptions and priorities shaped by the editorial values of their organizations. By allowing new voices into the room, the range of questions becomes more diverse, and the conversations more reflective of the issues that concern everyday Americans, particularly those outside coastal media hubs. Whether it's concerns about censorship on tech platforms, economic pressures in rural areas, or cultural debates that don't get mainstream coverage, these topics are now more likely to surface in high-level briefings. The selection process for the new media seat emphasized merit and audience engagement rather than institutional affiliation. This meant that individuals who had built credibility and followings through their own reporting and commentary could gain access, even if they lacked the backing of a traditional news organization. It signaled a break from the credentialing process that historically favored established players and instead opened the door to those who had demonstrated journalistic commitment and public resonance through independent means. Unsurprisingly, this initiative met resistance from some members of the legacy press corps, who saw it as a dilution of professional standards or an invitation for partisan actors to infiltrate the press room. But such criticisms often revealed a deeper discomfort with losing control over the narrative space. For years, the media ecosystem has operated with unspoken rules about who gets to ask questions, whose framing matters, and which voices are deemed legitimate. The new media seat disrupted that dynamic, introducing unpredictability and a broader spectrum of inquiry. Critics who equated new media with unprofessionalism overlooked the fact that many independent journalists operate with a high degree of rigor, transparency, and ethical integrity. They often face greater scrutiny from their audiences, with less institutional protection when they make errors. Many are subject matter experts who bring a level of depth and contextual knowledge to briefings that is sometimes lacking in generalist coverage. By recognizing their contributions, the administration was not lowering the bar. It was redefining it in line with the reality of how people now consume information. The introduction of the new media seat also had implications beyond the briefing room. It sent a message to aspiring journalists and commentators across the country that their voices mattered, that their work could lead to national relevance, and that access to power was not limited to a credential from a prestigious newsroom. It encouraged a new generation of media professionals to pursue journalism outside traditional paths, knowing that their efforts could be recognized and legitimized at the highest levels. It also challenged legacy institutions to evolve, to compete not just with each other but with a wider array of voices that are faster, more agile, and often more in tune with the concerns of ordinary citizens. This initiative reframed the relationship between government and media, shifting it from a closed-loop system of insiders to a more transparent and accessible forum for accountability. It acknowledged that the media landscape had changed, and that the mechanisms of power must change with it. Karoline Leavitt's public criticism of certain judicial decisions represents a sharp turn in how executive branch officials engage with the judiciary. Her remarks, pointed and unapologetic, reflect a belief that some courts have moved beyond their constitutional mandate of interpreting the law and have instead become active participants in shaping policy through selective rulings. This view is rooted in a concern that judicial overreach is being used as a tool to obstruct the enforcement of executive policies, particularly those that deal with urgent national issues such as immigration, public safety, and federal regulatory authority. The criticism focuses on what she perceives as ideological bias influencing judicial outcomes. She argues that certain judges, often appointed during previous administrations, are allowing their personal or political views to override legal principles and precedent. This has resulted in rulings that halt executive actions not because they violate constitutional boundaries, but because they conflict with a particular worldview. By labeling such figures as activists in robes, she seeks to draw attention to the increasingly politicized nature of judicial decision-making in high-stakes cases. This stance is not without historical precedent. For decades, public officials have debated the limits of judicial power, particularly when courts intervene to block legislation or executive orders. What makes this moment distinct, however, is the level of assertiveness and frequency with which these critiques are now voiced. In her view, the judiciary should not act as a parallel legislature, using legal interpretations to effectively govern from the bench. When judges repeatedly issue nationwide injunctions that suspend federal initiatives, she sees it as a systemic imbalance that undermines the principle of separation of powers. Her critique often centers around immigration policy, an area where executive authority has traditionally been given broad discretion. When judges intervene to block deportations, suspend asylum procedures, or pause construction of enforcement infrastructure, she argues that they are substituting their policy preferences for those of the elected administration. Such decisions, in her framing, not only obstruct the executive's ability to implement its agenda, but also compromise national sovereignty and security. The use of temporary restraining orders and preliminary injunctions by lower courts to halt actions with immediate impact has become a flashpoint in this broader institutional struggle. Leavitt's remarks also emphasize the consequences of these judicial actions beyond the courtroom. She links them to rising public frustration over inaction and gridlock, noting that when judicial rulings override executive initiatives, the public perceives a system that is incapable of responding effectively to pressing issues. This breeds cynicism toward all branches of government, as people begin to view the courts not as neutral arbiters of justice, but as extensions of political factions. In her rhetoric, the courts are not just blocking policies, they are blocking progress and responsiveness. The language she uses in these critiques is designed to resonate with ordinary citizens who feel disenfranchised by institutions that appear distant and unaccountable. By framing judges as unelected officials who impose their will on the public without facing the consequences of those decisions, she taps into a broader populist sentiment that seeks to reclaim decision-making, authority for democratically accountable officials. Her statements often highlight the lack of recourse the public has when courts intervene, contrasting this with the electoral checks that exist for legislators and executives. She also argues that the rise of nationwide injunctions issued by individual district court judges has distorted the judicial process.
Historically, judicial review operated within specific jurisdictions, allowing legal questions to be debated across multiple courts before rising to the Supreme Court. The modern practice of single judges issuing sweeping blocks on federal policy,
changes that apply nationwide, she says, short-circuits that process and hands immense power to individual jurists. This not only creates legal uncertainty, but also enables forum shopping, where plaintiffs file cases in specific districts known for producing favorable outcomes. Despite the controversy, Leavitt's position is not an outright rejection of the judiciary, but a call for recalibration. She acknowledges the importance of judicial independence and the role of courts in safeguarding constitutional rights. Her issue lies not with the institution itself, but with its recent trajectory. A shift, she believes, away from impartial judgment and toward ideological entrenchment. She has called for reforms such as clearer limits on the scope of injunctive relief, expedited appeals for executive-related injunctions, and increased scrutiny of judicial conduct when patterns of partisan rulings emerge. Her remarks have sparked a vigorous debate among legal scholars, civil liberties advocates, and political leaders. Supporters argue that her criticism is a necessary pushback against judicial activism that threatens executive functionality. Detractors contend that her approach risks eroding judicial independence by delegitimizing courts whenever they rule against the administration's interests. Regardless of perspective, her statements have reignited a fundamental conversation about the balance of power in American government, the role of the courts, and the meaning of accountability in a system where not all decision-makers are elected. Karoline Leavitt's actions and public positions mark a transformative moment in how political communication, media access, and institutional accountability are approached within the modern American landscape. Her decisions, whether choosing to boycott a traditionally elite event, opening White House access to new media, or openly challenging the perceived overreach of certain judicial rulings, reflect a broader shift in how power is engaged, questioned, and redistributed in real time. These are not isolated gestures, but interconnected components of a larger worldview, one that sees legacy institutions as increasingly misaligned with the needs and perspectives of everyday Americans. Her approach underscores a core belief in decentralization, of media control, of institutional authority, and of influence over public discourse. By inviting new media voices into traditionally exclusive political spaces, she is signaling that influence is no longer reserved for the few, but accessible to the many who work outside established systems. This idea is not merely symbolic. It reflects a practical shift in how people get information, who they trust, and what narratives shape their understanding of the world. In a rapidly evolving digital environment, her insistence on recognizing independent and alternative journalists as legitimate contributors to national dialogue speaks directly to the changing nature of truth-seeking in the 21st century. Simultaneously, her refusal to participate in what she views as performative, elitist rituals like the White House Correspondents' Dinner reinforces her broader rejection of ceremonial displays that no longer serve the public interest. For her, substance must always trump spectacle. This position speaks to a growing frustration with traditions that continue out of habit rather than purpose. Traditions that often serve to protect the status and prestige of a few while failing to reflect the realities of a diverse, digitally connected population. Her critique of judicial activism further exemplifies a willingness to confront institutional norms that are rarely challenged so directly. While respecting the need for judicial independence, she has drawn a firm line against what she views as a trend of unelected officials undermining the democratic process by blocking executive actions through ideologically motivated rulings. Her stance encourages a national conversation about checks and balances, not by denying the role of courts, but by demanding clarity and fairness in how that power is exercised. Taken together, these actions reflect a bold and unapologetic vision of political leadership, one that is not afraid to break with tradition, disrupt conventional power structures, and reimagine what inclusivity and accountability should look like. Whether one agrees with her methods or not, it is undeniable that she has expanded the boundaries of who gets to participate in national conversations, how institutions are held accountable, and what the future of democratic engagement might resemble. In challenging the status quo, Karoline Leavitt has positioned herself not just as a spokesperson, but as a force for structural and cultural change in America.